I've really chosen to talk about the last 3 years. I call it, I've got to watch this dodgy machine.
Arrows? Yes.
Yes. The last 3 years have been very, very, very weird, and I was meant to come here about 3 years ago. After having first come to Oslo in 1968, it was a bit of a shock not to be regularly coming. And then one was suddenly indoors, and I did this drawing very early on, depicting our apartment. There's me in a bay window with my laptop. There's my wife in another laptop, and we have a relatively small flat with a long garden. And that bit of the drawing that's off the picture is the beginning of a diagram showing me walking 30 meters down and 30 meters back, which is the length of our garden, endlessly. I think I did 80 in one day, exhaustingly. And really, that's the bay window. The bay window has been my life. The bay window has been that which the people sitting on the other end of the Zooms and the Teams and all that never see. They only see the room behind me. But that's actually where I am, in this little tiny, it should fit my history. The capsule. The capsule is, in fact, this old 100-year-old bay window. And, of course, there's a little bit of, if you look in the right place from the garden, you do see a piece of architectural formation. It's sort of flim-flam that was done, again, 100 years ago, to make a inner London suburban development based upon the tube coming out of the hill in Hampstead. It made it a bit sort of fancy, and it meant that they could charge more rents, and it's a very interesting exercise in sort of bourgeois development, which I might or might not come back to. And what do? We have thousands of books. My wife has her whole set of books in Hebrew. She then decided to do a PhD about 10 years ago, so you have even more books. People give us books. It's Bookspill. It's everywhere there are books. And then between the books, we sort of crawl out somehow. And yes, just one thing I want to say about the books. We have all these books, but in the lockdown, what I find myself doing, maybe it's a sort of old person speaking, I return to the favorites. I return to the Banham book. Banham was a close friend in the last years of his life. And I return to Peltzik, who, of course, I didn't actually know, but I've been fascinated by the work. So this book, which is not a particularly brilliantly written book, but I return to it 3-4 times. I go through the Peltzik, the story of the guy himself, which I think, being a teacher for a long time, you're very interested in the personalities behind the books. And this is where I live. X marks the spot. We have a lot of trees in the garden that looks onto a piece of contained open space, so that in the summer, if you look out and you don't see any houses, you just see trees and bushes, and lots of foxes and badgers and other interesting phenomena. And it's, in fact, of course, related to the railways, I said, that pokes out of the hill of Hampstead and creates the reason for that sort of fairly bourgeois development of 100 years ago, where people who really wanted to live at the top of Hampstead couldn't quite afford it, and worked in the city, so that the railroad, interestingly, goes straight to the City of London. And the only things that were open in that time were the coffee houses. The loft at the top of the hill and wired at the bottom of the hill. Even in the worst lockdown situation, there would be little queues of locals outside these particular... There are Starbucks and all the rest of the places which nobody would be seen dead going to. Nobody I know, anyhow. But the loft at the top and the wired at the bottom. And interestingly, in the district, if you walk a little bit, is a piece of heroic architecture, which is in fact the Alexandra Road housing of Camden Borough. So one started to track a little bit out of the immediate locality, and you began to sort of even accept third-rate architecture, which had some hints of the world modernist architecture, which one had in the back, one had visited in earlier times. But you get these sort of, even the thing of you're living in your flat, your street is a piece of urbanism, quite interesting urbanism. And then around the corner, up the hill, there are more things. And you start to look at stuff that you would never be seen dead bothering with, because that's as far as you dare walk in the lockdown. So that does a very useful thing to you. And then we gradually edged a little bit out. We took the car to Regent's Park. It was about 8 minutes drive. And you start looking at sort of, if not heroic, then a sort of urbanism, a sort of a level of sophistication which one was missing, if I'm honest. And of course, you could only communicate through this terrible thing, the bay window and the laptop. I started giving the odd lecture. The first lecture I gave was to Sci-Arc. And one was communicating either side of the lecture with a friend of mine who runs Sci-Arc called Hernan Diaz Alonso. And he's an exotic creature in an exotic city, I think, which is Los Angeles. And you're sort of sitting in this bay window, but really you're kind of willing yourself to have more than the rather stilted relationships you have via the laptop. And of course, a building was on the go, but I was too old, wouldn't dare go. One of my colleagues, much younger, who's still not caught COVID, actually kept going every week, sending me pictures, and you'd see a sort of detail, and you think, what do you think about that? And you'd sort of say, looks all right to me. What else could you do? But you could draw. And I draw, and I love drawing, and I make drawings, and now I make prints from the drawings, and people buy them, so that's sort of interesting. And I had time to sit in the garden. You may notice something funny behind my head there. And we went to Regent's Park. We managed to do different walks in Regent's Park, which is amazing. My wife is also about to plant an enormous number of roses. She reorganized the garden. And so we would use Queen Mary's Rose Garden as a place where she would photograph with her app, would tell her about the rose. She'd then phone up and see if you could get it. Everything came in cardboard boxes. If you take that first diagram, I used to sit in the bay window. I could tell the difference between the sort of guy who was a DHL guy, the guy who was actually a post office guy, the guy who was a sort of, grocery guy, even before you knew what was inside their boxes. Everything became like a sort of Madame Defarge character. Yes, life, even if somebody walked past with a pram or a dog, when in the 6 weeks we didn't go out at all, it became a theatre of the gate. The gate was a theatre. And I think this did, for somebody who's usually buzzing around all over the place, as you will see, it became another way of looking at how you regard the world, because you were forced into this gradually expanding territory. And I spent the lockdown, large part of it, making the gazebo. I ordered aluminium strip. I had an electric drill. If you made two drills, you could bend it and break it. And I just sat making this thing. Don't look at the detail. But now, it's working 2 years later. And of course, one's excursions moved a little bit further. And I remember my early days in London as a provincial coming up to London, being rather scared of London and having no money, that at least I would go to Hampstead, which did a curious thing, because at that time, Hampstead was like a kind of false provincial town or village, but in proximity to London. So you could sit on Hampstead Heath and not be engaged with the scary, busy, expensive town down there. You just used Hampstead. Now, we lived down the hill from Hampstead, but it became the first destination point, which also had nostalgia attached to it. Then there was the exhibition. I'm not supposed to show any work, but I had this exhibition in Louisiana, down the road in Denmark, and it, of course, like everything else, had been postponed and postponed and postponed. Then suddenly they said, "We're letting people in. Come on Monday, and meet the press. Meeting the press is rather like doing this gig. It's a bit of a weird one because you have to encapsulate a whole lot of things. In this case, 50 years of drawing in about a half-hour run around and trying to make it sound simple or whatever you're trying to make it sound. A weird one. Maybe tonight's weirder. And not allowed to show stuff, but I plodded around the exhibition, explaining this and explaining that, and then thinking, yeah, but that's not really what it's about. I mean, there's this pressure upon all of us, I think, who make things and do things, that you have to meet the press, you have to meet the client, you have to meet some fart face who comes up to you in the street and says, what's that about? And you come up with something and think, no, that's not really what it's about. Then I went to Tel Aviv. Now, I know that in Norway, Israel is a dirty word. I married an Israeli. She's lovely. What can I say? She's a left-wing Israeli. So, and therefore she is even flying in October at great expense and loss of life to try and vote against Netanyahu, which is a terrible, something that's, everybody she votes for never gets in. But anyhow, I digress. Tel Aviv, on the other hand, is a fascinating city, and I've been going there for nearly 35 years as a sort of cynical, non-Jew outsider. But it is a fantastic place, and I gave my first lecture. Now, I came out of the fucking bay window, and I saw real people like you, somebody picking their nose, somebody flirting, somebody going out, somebody looking puzzled, somebody looking fat, but all these things that you get with a real audience, people asking real questions. And it was great. God, shit, it was great. It was amazing. And also then somebody took me to see an interesting building in Haifa, which I hadn't seen before, which is by a guy called Leopold Gerstl, who is somebody that I remember putting in Archigram 5 because he did a pyramidal city project. Then I brought him to the Bartlett, and he was a weirdo. But I never knew that he'd done this really wonderful building. So part of the thing, the byproduct of going to places is also you see stuff, and I think there is no substitute for seeing stuff, quite simply. And you see stuff that you would never, even if you saw a book. We went to a social event. The guy who designed the Tel Aviv Art Museum was having his 90th birthday, and it was the 50th anniversary of the building. And suddenly one is at an event with people with glasses in their hands and all the usual bullshit. It was extraordinary. And we went to a concert, because we go to concerts. Our first concert after, months. And of course, some more things about Tel Aviv. I'm fascinated by people. If you teach for that long, you become really intrigued by people. I'm also interested in what things are now and what they represent. This is my favorite kiosk in the world. It's a wonderful modernist kiosk. When it was built, it looked like that. And the white city of Tel Aviv was very pure. Now it's like this. It's a nighttime town. And there are more scooters even than in Oslo. And of course, if you know the town, you can find idiosyncrasies. You can find things that are not at all Tel Avivian. They're sweet. They could be somewhere in kind of Lilliput land of Northern Europe. But it's an extraordinary nighttime town. And that was, again, one hadn't seen people, sweaty people, and 2 o'clock in the morning. That's the 2 o'clock. Like, come on. One had been sitting for a year in this strange bay window and garden situation. And, of course, it is a wonderful place to study architecture. One of the funny things I find is the way in which the world puts labels on things. They call it the Bauhaus city. There were actually 6 guys who were at the Bauhaus. They were all rather bad. There were much better people who never even went to a proper architecture school that picked up the gambits of modernism. But there's a whole discussion one could have about Tel Aviv, what it represents in terms of second, third-rate, even non-trained people doing actually rather good buildings within a certain mannerism, and if you know it well enough, with a lot of idiosyncrasies. So that's a conversation which, as a teacher, intrigues one. And then we meet friends in Malmö. Our first sort of private meeting with friends. We decided everybody else had gone to Greece. We went to Malmö. Aha! I hear. What the fuck? Malmö? Why didn't you come to Oslo, I hear you ask. And then we go to Belgrade. I work now in a tripartite organization with Ellen Blackstad-Hafner, who's the Oslo part of it, Branko Balacevic, who is the Belgrade part of it, and me in London, and our office exists on the waves, and really. And the thing that really hit, now this is sounding almost North European Puritan, it's full of people smoking. It was weird that you go to Belgrade and there's something, they're all smoking. When they're not smoking, they're sort of sitting. When they're not sitting, they're sort of smoking. And there's a sort of, it's very strange. It's a sort of melancholy about it. The city has a melancholy. Okay, we bombed it. I know we all bombed it, but you know, it's melancholy. It has very, very intriguing mixtures of architecture. So if one spent enough time, it would be interesting to home in. And I was taking some photographs this morning in Karl Johannsgate of groups of people in outdoor cafes, because I think there's a lecture there somewhere purely about people in outdoor cafes. But if you compare the Belgrade ones with the Tel Aviv ones, there are very noticeable differences of habit, dress, facial expression, and presence or non-presence of the cigarette. But there's some, you know, bad eclectic architecture fascinates me. The late Cedric Price always used to say to me, "Oh, Peacock, you like second-rate architecture." I find it sometimes more interesting than the correct stuff, because the correct stuff, we have it run down our throats, books, critics, the whole thing. But to watch somebody getting it slightly wrong is a test, is a certain sort of test. And again, then we went to Bournemouth. Now, I'm not really supposed to show stuff, but we went to a concert, and I combined Bournemouth, where I grew up for a long part of my youth, and first studied architecture, with a building, that thing that was merely scribbles and exchange things. Finally, you get to see it. And it was my birthday, and I just had a book coming out. So I did Bournemouth Birthday Building Book, and I invited my friends. This is in the middle, my wife, myself, my son, and his American girlfriend. I also invited lots of old friends like Odile Deck and Mike Davis, but I also invited new friends like Claudia Pascaro and her guy, who are Ecologic Studio in London. I wanted to bring so I brought a whole lot of people to give lectures. I used that as an excuse and hustled the university into bringing these odd people from London and wherever, because I thought, we're at last able to come together. Let's celebrate the building, not just by me spouting off, but various interesting other people. And a detail in the building, when I was a second-year student, I got hold of a little tiny cheap book about Asplund. And I've been fascinated by Asplund. That's a very, very, very long time ago. I've been fascinated by Asplund. And then, as we were finishing the project, I said, we need something in the middle of the main room. We need something, clock. We have a column, and we can have a clock. So this is a very poor version of the clock in probably one of my third favorite room in the world, which is the interior of what was the Gothenburg Law Courts. It's now part of the City Hall, I believe. And then we went to Los Angeles, our favorite place outside London, I think. Two notches ahead of Oslo, with Tokyo in between. And we automatically go and see the work of friends. We were able to spend a lot of time with Tom Main, whose drawings I'd been showing to students from the safety and comfort of the bay window, of course, but not going to see the actual stuff in his studio. Going to check out Eric Moss's latest and to meet them all. And then, more recently, we've been to Glasgow, to Edinburgh. And you live on the British Isles, and you know, I am unashamedly London-centric, except when I'm on an airplane, as you've noticed. But I realize I'm very London-centric. And then you go to Edinburgh, and you realize there's amazing stuff of one period or another period up there, and it is a city that goes beyond charm. I would like to discuss at some point the idea of charm in relation to cities and architecture. And then in Los Angeles, we were able to stay in a very special house, which is on the bottom right. And we were able to go to our favorite, which is in the edge of Santa Monica. Santa Monica, whenever Yol and I sort of think about escape, we think of Santa Monica. Not just LA in general, but Santa Monica in particular, dare I say. The furthest part west. You think of all those people who for whatever reason, found themselves or had to go and emigrate to the States, many of them to the Midwest. And then, if they could make it, they didn't stop at the Midwest, they went on. And Santa Monica is one of the ultimate points west. And our son, I have to report that our son is a very, however egocentric I am, however pleased with myself I may ever be, my son is now more famous than me. And I am now approached by people in architecture schools and elsewhere saying, "Are you the father of A.G. Cook?" And this is quite good for me. And he lives there most of the time, writing music and arranging music and promoting people and sometimes singing. And then Easter in Paris, that was something that we dreamt of. That finally we could, another set of friends. But one of the reasons I like Paris is because that's Berlin, and this is Paris. I like the sort of stuff in Paris that's not quite the oak. I love, I blanked on his name. That guy. Who has a road named after him. I blanked on his name, but it'll come. And then we were also taken to see buildings by somebody who we might be doing some cooperative work with, some greened buildings, and Brighton, most recently Brighton, which is called London by the Sea. Problem with it is it's too much like London, and it happens to be by the sea. I think that it's now we're getting more jaded by we're returning to the normal psychology, which is whereas instead of seeing all the charms of even second-rate crap, we're beginning, as you start to travel more, you start to become a bit more discriminate again. You say, well, Brighton's sort of all right, but it's a bit... And then to Oslo. My favorite room in Oslo is this room. It's spooky as shit. It's spooky. It's unbelievably spooky. Pure theatre, even the fact you have to bend your head. Mallet Stevens, by the way, was the French guy I was trying to think of. You have to bend your head to go in there, and you can only go in on a wet Thursday or whatever it is. And my other thing, you see, you realize, compared with the last two speakers, I'm much more hedonistic. I'm not very philosophic. I'm not very cool. I'm not very Nordic. I like fruity stuff and bourgeois stuff and I think that I haven't actually eaten in this restaurant, even in the last 2 visits I was here. And maybe it's memory lane. But there's something about the theatre restaurant. I've used it a number of times elsewhere in lectures, talking about the relationship of the neck of the restaurant, which I believe was originally used a lot by journalists who could watch who came through and dash out to the newspaper. The main body, where at early periods I went there, I think the first person who took me there was actually Sverre Fenn. And you would sit in a certain place if you were an architect, another place if you were a tourist. You're pushed by the mirror. And I think sort of dating tete-a-tete couples could go under the balcony. I love the idea that it's something as sort of usable as a restaurant can actually be contrived to be a piece of theatre. And I could never design like this. I'm not necessarily wanting to go back to 1905 or whatever it was. But there's something about bringing charm and elegance. And I have to give a personal admission that I prefer the west side of Oslo to the east. The east is all, you get an old industrial building, you make it grungy, then you show how clever you are by putting interesting details. But those guys built for comfort and charm, which I think we may have lost. And I collect kiosks. I think when I did this gig in Barcelona 4 years ago, I was talking about kiosks, and I'm fascinated by kiosks because they tell you a lot about the place, more than self-conscious architecture necessarily does. Bottom right is a grungy North London kiosk. It's in a particularly creepy bit of North London, and it kind of plays it. Comparing Pölzer, the family cook, when Alexander was living with us and would come here, we would all get off the plane in Oslo airport and go immediately to the Narvesen and have our first Norwegian Pölzer, complete with a vast amount of ketchup or mustard. And the Norwegian Pölzer tastes different from that which is a Danish Pölzer, and that which is a Malmö, that's a Swedish Pölzer. They all have sort of, well, Narvesen doesn't, but these have the same red sort of, but you look at the detailing. The detailing is different, and the sausage is different. And I think that kind of thing intrigues me, because much architecture, even some I've been showing, is a game played between one place and another, imported from the Bauhaus, imported from France, imported from internationalism, imported from Germany, particularly in Scandinavia, and then usefully misappropriated. And the same happens with kiosks. I think that's it.
Thank you, Peter, for the talk. We'll go with 2, maybe 3 questions. Starting with, say something about you feel like you're fruity. Probably my pronunciation was wrong, but I wonder, how do you define yourself? I remember you saying in a previous talk that you like to refer yourself as a joke academician.
Sorry?
How do you define yourself?
Oh, I think there are 2 or 3 central things. I think they're all to do with the same thing. I think I'm an enthusiast for architecture. And then as a result of teaching for 50 years, I become a student of human observation. Now, I'm not saying I'm better at one or the other, and they require different, architecture to some extent can be taught, or aspects of it. Human observation, I never went to a psychology course, and I'm sure I'd be, but I realized in the first year of full-time teaching that although for 2 years or more I'd been a sort of smart-ass critic, which is why the A brought me in to teach, it's very different from holding the hand of people, dealing with their paranoias, particularly as at the time 10 of my students were my age or older. That's scary. But I think I'm an enthusiast. I'm also find, therefore, that I can write about architecture in a curious way, not as an academic. I mean, I watched my wife fighting her way through a PhD, and it was sort of, oh, okay, is that what you really have to do? It was interesting, Beate said that too. But I can write like a journalist, because I'm interested in people, I'm interested in stuff. I find it, and I can write very easily. So I find I can turn an observation into words, and I found, for example, in the Danish exhibition, they suddenly threw me, can you do a paragraph about each drawing? And I did it by just looking at the drawing and talking as if I was telling you what it was about. And so that doesn't worry me, because as long as I can talk in the way that I would talk it. Now, if I then have to make sort of historical references and, you know, things about the medium, and, you know, does it represent that aspect of oh, forget it. I just talk about what was there. And of course, one's attitude to things changed. I mean, my attitude towards stuff has changed in the years that I started. I didn't really, apart from a few tiny things, didn't really start building until I was in my 50s. Interestingly, in parallel, I didn't have a child until I was in my 50s. And people used to say to me, oh, you know, if you have a child, change your life. If you start doing building, change your life. Actually, that was all bullshit. It was to keep you off the case. Both have been quite enjoyable experiences, and I think that you do get feedback. Even my crazy drawings, or my least, how can you describe them, the drawn drawings that are least likely as buildings, feed off the built stuff. You suddenly see what colour does, what shadows do, what an entrance that's too big or too small does. I'm always aware of funny things that you're not meant to notice. And that came from building, a sort of the degree of shadow cast by a beam. You can make umpteen models and all the rest of it. You never get it till you see it. The fact that a material is porous looking, or a material is offensive in some way, or the presence of a radiator. You know, you do the scheme, and then, oh shit, we need some radiators, and you think, oh God, that thing, it's like, it's in you want to blow it up. And so you have to consider all phenomena. And then if I return to the city again, you know, all phenomena. When I go down Karl Johan this morning, I notice that there are 2 kiosks have been put since I was here last, rather large ones, one of which is being used, and the other, they clearly can't get anybody to rent it. So you've got this interesting idea of a modernist kiosk placed in a symmetrical situation down a symmetrical garden in front of the National Theatre. But they can't use one of them because nobody wants it. That intrigues me. The fact that Narveson abandoned those modernist kiosks that they had about 15 years ago, which I loved, because obviously nobody wanted to buy anything in them. And that sort of thing is intriguing. I think I've gone off the point of the...
And there is one thing which intrigues me and fascinates me that you mentioned, so you mentioned also that you had kids in your 50s. You refer to Archigram as were rivals and allies, but also to your wife and your son as kind of also rivals and allies. And I wonder, how this duality, how that helped you to grow during your career? Find the right people and balance.
My wife is a powerful intellect. She's also trained as an architect, but hasn't been as successful as me, if I'm honest about it. But she is writing books, and her speciality is in beauty and architecture. And she's doing a lot of lectures and work on that subject. Now, this is something which is intriguing because it's a taboo subject. I think also particularly in certain architectural circles, beauty is sort of flim-flam.
But I was more...
And her arguments for things are much stronger than mine. I mean, she's, dare I say, more of an intellectual. I'm just somebody who works sort of instinctively, except I have an irritatingly large library of architectural anecdotes or instances. Like if I'm thinking about a doorway, I think of many, many doorways, not just from books, but from experiencing them. And I think, to me, one of the biggest frustrations of the current scene is that so many people work off downloading from the computer. They see something, they say, we're going to do 10 doorways. But they haven't been in them, they haven't seen them. They haven't realized that the tactile condition of the edges of the doorway, or the doorway in relation to the whole building. So there's a lot of, I think, why I look like a travel maniac is that I get an amazing stimulus by just walking around towns, particularly towns I know well. In fact, as an old person, I want to go back to towns I know more than discover new towns, because each time you go back, Oslo I've probably been to 43 times, and Tel Aviv 38 times. So they're ones I know well. And then you track back a street that you've seen change, or you notice something about something, and then you suddenly see it in another perspective. So tracking over is very important. I'm not answering that question.
No, but it's fine. I will say, Peter, because the talk was a bit longer than the talk was a bit longer than the 20 minutes or 28. We will say. I will say, if you can stay here, we start with a round. We will invite Rayulf and Beate to join us to a roundtable discussion. So you wait here. We are going to build up the roundtable discussion and collect the cards from the audience. So wait here, Peter. Thank you for your talk. Thank you.